So I'm press record now. Well, hello everyone. My name is Charles Rayburn. I am a customer success advocate here, senior manager of customer success for the success advocates here at ServiceNow. This is our office hour number 26. It's all about CSDM best practices. This is a continuation from the office hour we had last year. I think it was around the December timeframe. We had invited Scott Lim, one of our senior subject matter experts on CSDM. He's hosted a whole bunch of customer conversations as well as labs and other things with our knowledge. We're really excited to have him here for this hour. For those who are just dialing in and listening to the recording, definitely, if you have any questions that you want to ask, please feel free to send them to myself, Charles Rayburn, or your customer success advocate. We'll filter those and send them over to Scott and get some good answers. But definitely looking forward to this. Without further ado, Scott, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So let's start just by baselining. So again, discussion here is common service data model. What I ultimately want to get into are some examples. We put together quite a few examples towards the end of last year, and it's slowly making its way onto the Now Learning for everyone to see those. But I want to walk through those here today so you get some visibility into them and then ask some questions around them. And then time permitting, we'll be able to show you some forward view elements that we're working on in Rome and beyond. So again, baselining common service data model. Many of you are familiar with the common service data model. With that, making sure that we're identifying from a CMDB perspective, what are the best practices or the standards around creating an effective CMDB framework, and how do we pull those pieces and parts together so that we get the value we expect to see in all of the various products that base themselves off of the overall data inside of the CMDB. So we want to make sure that we're looking at that repository effectively. Obviously, there are hundreds of tables that exist inside of the CMDB. And in the new world, as we move forward, it's not just the CMDB that we've always thought of, where we're focused on the infrastructure pieces of applications and what we have from a hosting or middleware perspective. It's really expanded much more beyond that, taking visibility into our design objects and what we're soon to release, our build objects, and then managing things that aren't just IT. So we're starting to look into the IoT, the OT, those types of elements as we move beyond just, again, a traditional CMDB. So I want to talk about common service data model as it exists today. 3.0 is our current version. We will be updating this to 4.0 in the Rome timeframe. So that's going to be towards the end of this year. And we'll allude to some of those new things that are coming in the future as well. As it exists today, we break the common service data model into 4 domains. We introduced the foundation domain in the 3.0. So that's really talking about critical referential data. And the key here is referential data. At this time, what you see here, none of those objects are configuration items in the CMDB. They're quite often the reference data that we have as attributes on many of our CIs. In the future, we're going to add business process. That's that gaping hole in the upper left in the gray section here. That is a CI, but it's still going to be referential. It's going to identify what are all of the various pieces and parts that make up that process, and they aren't just CIs that make up that process. It could be locations, it can be people, it can be documents. So that's going to be something for the future. But at this time, we're focused on what's the core data, what's our org structure, and making sure we have that set up properly, company, business unit, and if necessary, department. Understanding locations and managing those data elements effectively inside of the repository. Groups and users. CMDB group becomes extremely important. We'll be referencing that shortly and often, both what we have currently available associated to a dynamic CI group, as well as development that we're working on right now to manage data inside of the CMDB. Product models have always been an element that we reference on every single CI, just hasn't been prevalent throughout the CMDB. That's going to become much more prevalent, especially as we expand the design domain to include build functions. And then contracts are referenced in multiple areas inside the platform now. So we just want to make sure we have consistency in the use of those contracts, and we're not just looking at them through a single lens of a single product on the platform. So that becomes the foundational data. Obviously, you're going to have a process owner that will be responsible for the processes that exist, the steward of the overall data, product owners, as we show more around product models, and then folks that manage contracts. So that becomes the foundational piece. But now if we start flowing the story, so we'll have business units, and this is one of the reasons for the foundation to exist. identifying our business units and what applications do those business units have responsibility of? What do they care about? What's important for that business unit to function? Then they have, in essence, ownership of the business applications that provide specific capabilities inside of the business. So the design view is really identifying what are those capabilities so we can rationalize our business applications, our portfolio of applications that exist inside of our organization, also identifying the types of data that could exist inside of that application, and in the future, being able to manage that data, and so that you know exactly where sensitive data, as an example, might be used, how it's used, and audit those functionalities from a governance and risk perspective. The business application really is that portfolio. It's version agnostic. So we're not trying to say exactly every single thing that we have out there. It's primarily focused on the data center or the cloud environments, those things that we spend lots of money on, not so much the desktop software. And what is essentially the view or the portfolio that we have of all these applications. As you deploy them, we move down to the orange section. We've got the application service, identifying what our unique instances are of those business applications, and then all of the middleware hosting environment that exists for those applications. The rest of these pieces are who's responsible for managing and maintaining those applications. And as we introduced in Paris, the dynamic CI group, moving towards automation. The last thing we want you to have to do is to maintain your CMDB manually end to end. So with that, we introduced the dynamic CI group, which was actually a pre-existing table. We just kind of took it over and renamed it. It acts as a grouping mechanism of CIs, and it's actually referencing a CMDB group. CMDB group is an object that's been in the platform for a while. It's a place to store, for example, queries from Query Builder. So you can have a query of CIs, which result obviously in a group of CIs. This CMDB group is not a CMDB CI table. So what we do is we now have a dynamic CI group, which is a CMDB CI table. It's going to reference CMDB group that could have multiple queries associated to it. So now that we can identify a collection of CIs. For example, if I wanted to create a dynamic CI group that said, give me all my Linux servers or give me all my Windows servers that are in the EMEA region. Now I'm starting to create, through automation, a collection of CIs that I can then reference to a technical service offering to say, these are the CIs I oversee and am responsible for. Or you could use that dynamic CI group for patch management. These are all the CIs that I'm going to be patching. Put that dynamic CI group as the configuration item in change. And today you'll have to create your own business rules to then populate the affected CIs with all of the CIs that are part of that dynamic CI group. But one of the elements ITSM is working on for the Rome release is to have that out of box. So you'll be able to use dynamic CI group in incident change, and then also identify all the CIs that are part of that dynamic CI group automated as part of that change process. That's a piece being worked on in Rome. But now that we have that, means that we can now create functionality such as that. In our Quebec release, which is released here soon, we've added synchronization capability. So on that technical service offering, which is again, identifying who's responsible for managing and maintaining, we can have populated our managed by group, our support group, our change group, and we're synchronizing that onto the dynamic CI group and then onto all the CIs that are part of that dynamic CI group. What does that give us? Well, now you go out, you discover a new server. Do you discover who owns it? Do you discover who supports it? No, that's impossible. But so long as you have your dynamic CI groups, your queries established, that new server that might be discovered can be automatically associated, runs daily to a dynamic group, which then automatically is going to gain that manual metadata and put it onto that CI. So we're starting to introduce that automation as opposed to the old days of managing everything manually on every single CI. We're making it more simple. So this orange section is really about what do we have that's deployed technology and who's responsible for managing it and maintaining it. As we move into the green section, this really becomes who consumes or uses that technology. This becomes the business. What do they use that technology for? What is impacted in the business if that technology has an issue? So we're really separating the functions here of the people who are responsible for providing it, so we can do rapid routing of our incidents and work through our changes, but then also understand what is impacted and who uses it. On a service offering, being able to identify the subscribe by, the users or locations that might use it or companies that might use it. So you understand who is impacted, not just what is impacted. So this becomes the common service data model as a whole. and it will expand. As I mentioned, there's a piece that we're working on for the 4.0 model. There's somewhat of a gap. If we go from a design function of, hey, as an architect, I have these portfolio of our applications, and then I have a bunch of stuff deployed. In between there is where you build it, where you develop it. And a business application could be made up of multiple components. So what's actually deployed isn't a single application service for an instance, but multiple application services. It might be from a microservice perspective, where you've got multiple pieces that are being deployed. So what we're working on right now in Rome, and will be an update to the common service data model, is an object we'll put in between here, which becomes the components of a business application. And that way you can identify those pieces and parts of a business application, maybe the microservices, the API, whatever those elements are, and then what those individual installations of code become as application services, so that we can now get a better visibility into all of those pieces and parts. So that's something on the horizon for everyone to look forward to. Until then, let's look at examples of what we can do today. The traditional example that we've always showed off inside of our examples is what we have for ServiceNow. So assuming, since we're talking ServiceNow on the call, you have ServiceNow, what would that look like built out? And ServiceNow really is a platform application, which means we've got the platform and we have multiple applications that run on that platform. So in this scenario, we've got our business application of ServiceNow as the platform host, and on business application is an attribute called architecture type, where you can identify that that's the platform host, or it's a platform app that runs on that host. So if we look at various platform apps, it could be the mid server, it could be ServiceNow Change, it could be ServiceNow HR. All of those are platform apps that are part of that overall host. So you can start to build that hierarchy of modules, et cetera, from a platforming perspective. Each of these will have their own deployments. So from an HR perspective, I got my deployment of HR, ServiceNow Paris, HR Prod. That depends on the overall platform. So the platform has its own instance, ServiceNow Paris Prod. So you start to identify kind of a hierarchy of your deployment pieces, so that if that platform is down or having issues, then your platform app is impacted. So you start to see those pieces. You'll also notice that we want to identify every instance. So dev, QA, prod. Obviously, at a minimum, we want to identify prod. But for many organizations, we have the ability to identify the other instances as well. When we start talking about who's responsible for managing or maintaining these pieces, that jumps over and again into those technical service offerings, where we identify the managed by group, the support group, change group, et cetera, as well as its criticality and SLAs that are associated to it. At the application service layer, it is likely that you would have two technical service offerings, one to identify the team that takes care of the production instances, and then the other that is taking care of the non-production instances. It might be the same team, but they're going to have different criticalities. Obviously, you're going to have much faster response time on the production instances than you're going to have on the non-prod instances. So having two technical service offerings in this space becomes valuable, because if you start to look at the data to validate if any sort of SLA was breached or OLA was breached, that's the data that's going to be kept on that technical service offering to know, did you respond in the appropriate time for these particular applications? Now, do we usually care about that internally as much as we care about that when vendors provide it? These technical service offerings can also identify that the vendors providing that service. So did they respond as quickly as they are contractually obligated to perform? So that's where you start to break up kind of a prod versus non-prod view of the management of our applications. But as we break down to the lower layers of the middleware and the hosting environment, it's likely to have just a single grouping of, for example, the middleware management team that takes care of all of those applications, regardless if it's prod or non-prod, or the Windows management team that takes care of all of the Windows servers, regardless if it's prod or non-prod. So those layers become much easier to validate. And again, the goal here is let's manage the manual metadata on that service offering and transfer those onto those CIs, as well as how you expect that service to be performed. As we move up in the green section, as we build out for Paris, ServiceNow Paris HR Prod, then we've got what is the business that utilizes that. So we've got mobile onboarding, enterprise onboarding, part of overall onboarding, which is part of new employee and human resources. As you see here in the green section, we're not actually referencing technology. So about the technology is really the people providing it, and the green from the business services is really how does the business use that technology? Because it might be ServiceNow HR today, but heaven forbid, next year it might be a different application that you use for that. So now you can start to swap things out, and what you have from a business dependency remains ultimately the same. So this becomes that platform view into the environment. As organizations build out their applications using the common service data model, the first application you build out is never just a single application. And the reason for that is you often have dependencies on other pieces. So if we look at shared technical services, then we have that piece where you actually end up having no green whatsoever, because it's essentially technology for the sake of supporting technology. In this scenario, we've got Active Directory. So Microsoft Active Directory, we've got our deployment of Active Directory, we've got all the middleware pieces, the hosting, the teams that are responsible for the various areas. But instead of a green section of the business that depends on it, instead we've got other applications that depend on it. So building out our shared technical services become an important element, because if any of those shared technical services go down, what other technologies are impacted by it? So what we get out of here again is who's responsible for maintaining that technology, and then what is impacted if that technology is having an issue. So this becomes the value of the common service data model. How can I consistently build these pieces out? So as our products that are built on top of the platform utilize the data, they have the data in a consistent spot and then can provide value to you based off of that data. Other examples to jump into, I want to touch on microservices because it's probably one of them that we hear a lot. And so how do we build out microservices in the environment? And this really depends on what we're talking about with microservices. So I'm not going to get into the whole Kubernetes piece because that's already discovered and part of the ITOM space. But for those that aren't in a managed system and instead are being independently developed, it really comes down to being two types. A standalone microservice that other pieces are going to reference a lot, or a microservice that's really part of multiple microservices that are part of a single application. So the first one I want to show is the standalone. And in this scenario, what we have, as I build all these out, what we have is a microservice that we really know we're creating that other applications are going to be referencing over and over again. So we're really treating it just as a regular application. We're going to have, in this scenario, it as a business application. In this scenario, we call it tax calculation. And then we're going to have a deployment of it, which is its very specific version in production. And other applications are going to depend on it and hit on it and use it. And that's it. So we're treating that microservice when it's a standalone, just as if it's any other application out there. Where things get a little more different is when you've got multiple microservices part of a single application. So let's show that example. In this scenario, build this out. So we have an application called Online Sales Management, and it ends up being deployed as Online Order Management version 5 production. But it's actually made up of multiple microservices to be able to provide that application. So what we're really saying in those scenarios is it's fine to have a hierarchy of application services. This deployment of this application service is actually made up of multiple pieces and parts, of which are microservices or APIs or other elements that will come together. You don't necessarily have to have a unique business application for all of those individual microservices if they exist only under the umbrella of a single application. So this is where we start moving into how would we manage these pieces moving forward to understand how would we model out a microservice. Now in the future, we're going to add a piece into this equation so we can start to get some visibility into the design view. So we'll actually be able to identify at the business application through what's being done in build, what are the components of the business application, and then tie those individual microservices to each of those components. So that's a quick view of some examples. So not to take too much time on CSDM, I wanted to show a few examples and then make sure that we could answer some questions. And depending on questions, then I can get into some forward-thinking pieces. So if acceptable, I'll pause now for questions and we can start working through them.
Hi, Scott. This is Kevin from Kaplan. I have a question about your ServiceNow example. In the ServiceNow platform, I started looking at the business application and poking around, like how does the SN change run, the business application SN change run on the business application ServiceNow, because it runs on the platform that it is ServiceNow. That's how you would connect it in the record business application, but for an application, when you do the mapping, you have your dotted lines. Can you explain the dotted lines and what I need to relate them somehow in the relationship table? So in a dotted line scenario like this, because the mapping doesn't automatically occur because S&Change runs on the application that is ServiceNow, it doesn't create the mapping, so we have to go create it.
So let's pull up so everyone sees what you're talking about. So out of box, as soon as you identify that something is a platform application, we then have an attribute so that a reference can be made to that platform host. So your question, going back to the design, it's a dotted line because it's a reference as opposed to a relationship, correct?
That's correct.
And so is what you're getting at, you want to be able to see that in a dependency view?
Correct. So if somebody has an issue with the application service and the module that's having the issue is change, not incident, or HR, we need to know that what is connected to this application via that dotted line.
Okay, but you're not using these objects in incident and change, right? You're not using a business application as the configuration item in incident or change, are you?
At the moment, we haven't defined that, but I'm pretty sure that I might get asked that question. Like if a module of the application is actually having an issue, the platform app is related to the host. I'm pretty sure I'm going to get asked that question. What is related to that?
Okay, so we have two topics I want to work through. First off, never, ever, ever use these blue objects in incident and change as the configuration item. Reason for that is these are not operational CIs. They don't give you the detail of how it's been deployed or configured or who's responsible to support it or who's responsible from a change perspective. This is more from a portfolio planning perspective. That's what these objects are meant to be. So they're not meant to be used operationally. It doesn't have that operational data detail. That operational data detail lives down in the actual deployment. So we know exactly where that instance is. If I select just ServiceNow HR, okay, I could have 4 different instances. Which one am I having an issue with? And I could have 4 different prod instances. Which one am I having an issue with? It doesn't give the detail of the actual deployed operational object. That's what exists down in application service. So application service always should be what's utilized as the configuration item on an incident and change. That's not to say that you couldn't utilize the business application attribute on an incident to narrow down what CIs to choose. So if you were to say, hey, I'm having trouble with HR, I choose it as my business application, it then filters down the configuration items to only show the HR application services. So you can choose which one is the configuration item. That's perfectly acceptable, but the actual configuration item should never be any of the objects from the blue.
Correct.
The second scenario is you really can show these references in the dependency view. And we went through that in our K20 lab.
Yeah, I would say it relies on the application. That would be the one that I would choose.
No, you don't create any relationship because you don't have to. What you have in dependency views is map related items. So I'm going to leave this object, go into map related items. Map related items allows us to identify where we can show references in addition to relationships. So in here, identifying if I have a reference from a business application to a business application using the attribute of what we were just on, that attribute that gets selected as soon as you say you have a platform app, then it will be able to show in the dependency view those pieces that are dotted line to each other, not just full relationships. So this already exists. This is out of box. You'll see some of them that exist out of box. We'll make sure in the future that we have business application gets updated in that list as well. But just as you would see references of the objects that exist to a server, then it's the same scenario. You can show in the dependency view reference pieces, not just full relationships. So we don't want you to create a relationship when you don't have to. We just have to add an entry here into the map related items.
Okay, yeah, that answers that then.
Yeah, I want to just follow up. So business applications mapping with other business applications should be done as references rather than relationships.
When it's a platform, yes.
Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thanks, Kevin and Doug. Other questions from customers out there? Feel free to ask.
I'm Patrick from FX. My question is more, I work more on the ITBM side, APM, and who do you see being responsible for, and how do you manage that relationship between the business application and the application service? Who's responsible for maintaining that relationship?
That's a very, very good question. So it's different for different organizations. There are some organizations that function in what we call a team view, where the team is responsible for everything related to that application. So in that view, it's not just the business application they're responsible for. They are also responsible for the development of that application and the operational view. So they have the whole stack, so to speak, from business application to all the design components, and then into the application service and how it's being managed there. That team view isn't effectively represented in any sort of attributes today in the platform. One of the things we're designing in Rome is that team view. It's going to be a related list on the business application, some other objects. It's going to, at a minimum initially, synchronize with the attributes, contact attributes that we already have on the CI, who's the support group, who's the change group, who's the owner. But it'll offer the opportunity to add additional team members. So what's my level 1, 2, 3? Who's my security person or team that I need to focus on assisting with this particular application? Anyone and everyone that could be involved with that business application becomes an optional element that you could identify in that team's view. It's a piece that we've had requested for quite a while. And that's one of the solutions we're going to be releasing, hopefully here in Rome. And that will solve a lot of those use cases. Outside of a team view, who's responsible for those pieces when we don't necessarily have a team, but we do have defined layers? Well, the application owner is responsible for that business application. And that could be an enterprise architect. It could just be an application owner, but they're responsible for that object and how it's being designed. They may not be responsible for its deployments, but they're at least needing to be understanding in the visibility of those deployments. One of the pieces we added in Paris was the application service, kind of a wizard in the creation, so that in that application service, we could identify what is the business application. So we end up making this more of a two-way street. So let me show that piece if you haven't seen it. Let me jump to another instance. So when I go to generate a new application service, we actually have a new environment to help create that application service. With that, so I'm going to be creating a new application service. I don't necessarily have it deployed yet. So let's assume this from a manual perspective. And I'm going to just give it a name. What environment? So knowing this is dev, QA, prod, etc. is going to be important. This one's going to just be development for now. I can give a version to it. I can reference this back to a model number of what was being generated. And this is down below, set relationships. So whether it's a business application, I can identify, okay, this is actually part of a specific business application. I have one in here. As I work through this process, this will automatically generate that relationship for me. So every application service should have some relationship back to a business application. And that's critical. That's actually one of our defining pieces in the common service data model. So this helps us to make sure moving forward, as I create an application service, I'm actually identifying what is that business application. Also, if I already know who's responsible for taking care of it, if I had objects already identified, I can identify the technical service offering. I can identify the business service offering that this is providing opportunities for. In a patch update that we'll have for this in the near future, we'll be able to do hierarchies for that application service. Is this application service actually not directly related to a business application? Is it actually instead a child of another application service, similar to what we were showing with microservices? So that piece is going to be made available shortly in a patch update. So those are the types of scenarios where we start to make it easier to manage that data. But back to your question of who should be responsible, if you're an owner of an application, you should have visibility and understanding of how and where that's being deployed. If you're managing applications that are deployed, you should have an understanding of what that's based off of from a design perspective. So we're trying to make that visibility both ways.
So it would be, yeah, so it would be that application owner, once he sees a deployment, that would be responsible for going and creating that relationship? Or is it at deployment that you see the technical side deploy and go through the other side, right? They create the application service just like you showed and relate it back to the business application.
So today we're gonna have to go in and create those, whether it's coming from the business application perspective or the application service. The application services obviously makes that a bit easier.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, when I say tomorrow, these are things that we're working on for Rome and beyond. We're taking care of that for you. So if we consider this a process, we've got the data objects, we've got the tables of where data should be. What we've been working on in our efforts in development is to now automate that stuff for you. The last thing I want you to do, and trust me, you'll go bald like I am, you do not want to manually maintain all of these objects. So what we're designing is in conjunction with DevOps, tying the business application to a DevOps object. As DevOps does their stuff and does a release, it's automatically creating the application service as it does its release if it's not already there, and creating the relationships so you don't have to. So those are the type of pieces that we are creating now. We don't want to create more objects in the repository if we're not automating the maintenance and management of it.
That's good news.
Great questions. Very great questions. John, did you have a question?
John Miller? Yes, I did, and it may be a kind of like a foundational one, so I apologize if it's very, very basic. We're a very immature organization, so a lot of the relationships we haven't even kind of built into our CI yet. I've made the decision that we do not include any applications as business applications if they don't have a business owner and they're not directly used by the business, just because that's where the value is. So you use an example of AD as a business application. I don't define AD as a business application. I don't define any of the kind of what I consider the IT infrastructure as a business application. Am I thinking about that wrong? What is your definition of a business application that would include things like AD or other IT tools?
Well, first off, my definition of business application is anything from a data center or a cloud perspective. So nothing that is desktop. Don't worry about managing desktop in business application.
That's good. I did make that delineation. I definitely differentiate between application and software, which would be on a desktop.
Great. From there, it's really what are you willing to maintain or need to maintain? If you need to have visibility into the fact that a shared technical service could be impacting your application, then certainly go ahead and build it out. If you don't need to have that visibility, then don't build it out. I'm of the type where I don't want to boil the ocean, because the more data I put in there means the more data I have to manage and maintain. So slowly growing into it, perfectly acceptable. Take care of your critical applications first that you really care about. And if you need to get to further layers, as you do those management efforts effectively well, you're creating the proper processes and the culture to manage and maintain those. So as you add more into it, it's not as hectic to maintain more CIs. So your approach isn't wrong, but in the long run, you might find that you need to have those objects in there when you're ready to maintain all of them.
Okay, good. No, that's helpful. I will kind of continue my path at the moment, but I will keep my mind open to when we reach that point where it may make more sense to increase the scope. Okay, thank you.
Hopefully it doesn't get to the point where the Active Directory does cause an issue and now someone says, why weren't we maintaining it? So you want to do it just before that.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
I'd like a follow-up on that question.
Go for it.
I really appreciate your guidance on being flexible, and in the context of creating severity ones. I always struggle with this. We want to effectively communicate to our organization the status of our systems. Where would you advise to focus on that? What would we create the outages on? Business application, application service? If you could give some guidance there. I'm struggling with that right now.
So specifically focused on outages?
Yeah, specifically focused on outages, being able to keep the, we use subscriptions, so people subscribe to things for notification, right? I need to expose our common service data model to our customers as well. I want to make it digestible for them.
So you referenced outages, and so that always kind of tweaks my interest because it's a very specific technical capability inside of the platform. So if we're specifically referencing outages, at this time, the value of outages has to be at the service offering layer. So though you and I can agree that it could be the server that is causing the outage, and we want to make sure that we identify that that server has an outage, the capability that we provide and depend on at this time is at the service offering layer. So there's nothing to keep you from putting that outage on the server or on the application service, but ultimately it has to get associated to the service offering or any of the data rollups will not function. And I say at this time because the functionality of outage that exists today in the platform has not been updated since it was originally created. And I've been around ServiceNow for 8 years. I started in the Aspen Berlin days, and I do not think that has been updated since then. Now, as I mentioned, the scenario of really we're talking about that application is having the outage or the server or the network. Well, I was always taught network never has an outage, so we'll ignore that layer. But from that perspective, you want to get as close to the item that's causing the outage as possible. But in ServiceNow, all of the functionality is focused on the service offering. So you're going to have to do it in 2 layers at this time, but we are fixing it. We have that on a roadmap that we're identifying where we can improve upon what outage is and what is outage, because outage doesn't necessarily have to be 100%. It can be where something is impacted but not completely out. So we're doing layers to all of that. So we're really improving to what outage always should have been, but that's taking a little bit of time. But today with outage, you can identify an individual CI, but you ultimately need to get it to that service offering. And then the data rollups on that service offering, you start to identify what is how is that performing? And if you don't mind, I can show you real quick how that starts to look. I don't know if anyone has been to the Service Owner Workspace.
That is also one of the next questions, is being able to report our uptime of our services to our internal and external customers.
You're going to love this then. We'll go with internal starting out.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have seen Service Owner Workspace. This was introduced in the New York release. It's part of ITSM Pro, and that's where Service Portfolio Management lies, is in the ITSM space. So I'm actually in their demo instance because it needs a little more data than I have on my personal instances. And so they have this Service Owner Workspace. And that Service Owner Workspace, as I start walking through the hierarchy real quick, just so you start to understand, It's based off of having a service portfolio. So I have my services, but then they're in a hierarchy of a portfolio. And that's where this data starts to lie, as I'm going to start building into this view of the service portfolio and my business services and my business service offerings. So that's the area I'm going to be focused on right now. So I've got Service Owner Workspace. I open that up. Got to log in, of course. And this view that you're going to see, this workspace view, that is the user experience that much of our platform is migrating to right now. You're going to see a similar environment released for CMDB management in our Rome timeframe. So this view that you see here, so this, first off, I'm having a hierarchy. This is that service portfolio hierarchy. First, I've got EMEAs, I got Americas, I got EMEAs. I'm going to go to all services in EMEAs. These are all of those. You start to see some data roll-ups based off of that hierarchy. I'm going to go into hardware support. This is one of those nodes in that service portfolio. Service portfolio are not CIs. This is an SPM thing, but we forced them to make it out of box so that everyone can use it. This becomes a roll-up. So this is a node. Hardware support is one of the nodes in the hierarchy in service portfolio. And you start to see you've got an owner at this particular node level. You've got a roll-up of the spend and performance of how all of the various nodes coming together start to operate. There's more nodes. So again, this is a hierarchy. I'm going to go into print, scan, fax. Again, this is a node in service portfolio. I'm not yet to a CI. But here I can start to see my first CI. So this is a business service of printing services. I could have multiple business services here that are part of this particular node. In this scenario, I just have one. But I've got a node owner at this level that's in charge of print, scan, fax, and start to see some roll-ups. But now I can get into my first CI. So I'm going to click on that. And this is a business service. Unlike form views today, which are static and not pretty, this becomes the view of the future. So when I say a workspace, what we're working on in CMDB is our very first landing page for CMDB using this workspace type of view. So this is going to be the future here. And then we'll move into even better user experiences after that. So this is a business service. And so as you see, I've got details, analytics about the business service, not just attributes on the CI. How is this business service performing? And as you see over here, outages, because it's looking at the outages of the service offerings and rolling it up to assume how my overall business service is performing based off of outages on those service offerings. So this data that I'm seeing is really a roll up from my service offerings of how we're overall performing. But I can go into an individual service offering to see how it is performing. But these information elements that you're starting to see here, what are the trends? You start to see the elements over time. Relationships, this is actually the piece I like a lot. What do I depend on and what pieces depend on me? And so having that view becomes extremely important. And again, this is at the business service level. So if you think about your customers or your executives where they want to see their pieces and how they're performing, they get to see their view here, not the customers, but the folks that own these services and run these services. Back to the overview, I'm going to go into the business service offering. So this is a layer deep in that hierarchy. We're now at the service offering. And again, these are the outages. I've got 9 recent outages. That's probably not good. And currently have one that's working through. So you start to see the view of outages, which give you your availability. So this is that piece that outages, as they're designed today, are based to give you visibility and value at the offering layer. So you're not going to have availability at the server layer. You're not going to have the availability at the application service CI. Instead, it's going to show at the service offering as of today. But this, so long as you have those service offerings, whether it's from a technical perspective or a business perspective, you can use this availability to see how it's performing. So that's that piece I wanted to tie in. I also just wanted to show you Workspace so that you understood this is the direction of our user experience and not the list and forms that we have known in the CMDB since the dawn of time. Does that help?
So you did say something critical. Business services are not CIs, right?
Business services are CIs. It's service portfolios are not CIs.
Service portfolios are not CIs. Thank you.
Yeah, so when we go back to the model, we see service portfolio here. Those aren't actually CIs.
But business services can be.
Business services are CIs.
Yep.
Yeah, they're CMDB underscore CI underscore service. They're extended off of the core CMDB CI. So they are CIs. And service offerings are CIs. So basically, in the blue, orange, green sections, the only things that are not CIs, request catalog items are obviously not CIs. That's part of request and catalog. And the service portfolio is not a CI.
What would you recommend for someone that doesn't have this currently implemented in a crawl scenario?
Great question. So let me get to that. We put that together. There's two views really when you start thinking about how do I implement. And based off of, I was in professional services for many years. I've managed my own CMDBs and implemented many of them around the world. And there's really two views. And not that I want to say maturity, because people don't want to be called immature, but it's where is your perspective and visibility? Most organizations, especially from an IT perspective, have visibility into their applications, and they consider their world revolves around the applications and not necessarily what their business services are. Most IT shops don't know what the business services are. So from that view, we look at this from an application focused perspective. And so from there, again, with our CSDM3, we introduced foundations. Let's make sure we get our foundational data set up right. And if you're a large organization with many locations, you understand the criticality of making sure that core data is set up properly, because locations are probably the most duplicated entities in the core data when we've got the same location listed multiple times, but with different labels. So again, foundation is important. Crawl is really about that start of the application world. What's my portfolio of business applications? Where do I have them deployed? And assuming I have some sort of automation, discovery, or service mapping, what are all the pieces and parts of what's been deployed? That's crawl, and that's where you start. So you just start out, what are my portfolio of applications? A question earlier, what do I consider a business application? Start out with your critical applications, the one that you care about the most if there's an issue with them. Once you move past those, then what are the next level of applications that you care about? Focused on the pieces that are data center oriented, not your PC software. So that becomes your path in building out crawl and what applications to focus on. And start to understand, where are they deployed? Where's your production instances at a minimum? And if desired and needed, where are your subprod instances, and identify what those objects are, and then start tying everything that you can find in discovery to those pieces. That's crawl. That's how to get started in an application focus. From there, immediately and as quickly as possible, who's responsible for all these things? As I have my deployments of that application, who do I need to go to if I have an incident? Who do I need to go to that's going to perform the change at all of those layers, whether it's at the application service layer or the database or the host, whatever those are, who do I go to? You now have the foundational information to create a technical service offering, which is the object that says these are the folks responsible for taking care of these things. So you'll quickly move from crawl to walk just by identifying who's responsible for it and grouping it together. Now, the reason for grouping this together, and I'm going to give a shout out to Novartis, who did this first, and I thought it was a really good idea, and that's why we latched onto it. Managing all of that manual metadata on all of those individual CIs, especially discoverable ones, is frustrating. You'll go bald like me, just trying to manage all of that. But if I can identify, for example, the team that's responsible for all my Windows servers, and I identify their support group, their criticality, and the change team, and now I can reference all of those CIs that are part of that team's efforts. Now I'm not having to micromanage hundreds or thousands of CIs individually. Instead, I'm managing one and synchronizing that data onto all of them. So that becomes the reason to quickly get to walk as quickly as possible, so that you can easily manage these CIs, because you don't want to do it manually. How quickly you get to run and know what your business services are, that's the baby steps. Some organizations can get it done in 6 months. Some organizations, it takes years. Canadian National Rail, before they came to ServiceNow, they spent 2.5 years just trying to figure out what their business services were. One of the reasons why they chose ServiceNow was because we had a capability to understand services and layers of services and how they offer and support the environment, and it allowed them to slowly grow into it. And they spent approximately 2 to 3 weeks trying to understand what their services were in relation to how we identify them in ServiceNow. And they had a partner help them, and they had TBM as a foundational element to look at, but they spent 2 to 3 weeks. Previously, they spent 2 years. So having a structure that has you slowly move into it rather than trying to boil the ocean to do it all at once is extremely helpful. And they were able to implement in 6 months. So think of it as, let's focus on the technology first, my applications, where they're at, and what makes up the pieces and parts of them and who hosts them. Then who's responsible for maintaining them? And then how does the business actually use it? And then you'll slowly move into CSDM in a more effective manner. Again, this is focused on an application view. It could be a service view. You could know what your services are, and this is few and far between. It's usually the regulated industries, and I'll be honest, Europe, that is more effective at doing this. But it might be that instead I'm building out my services first, and then identifying what my applications are and the infrastructure and tying it all together. So those are different views on how to put that together. Does that help out?
Yeah, that was an amazing explanation. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad that I got that recorded. Time for one final question. Patrick, did you have one?
I was just going to say, if I have follow up on that, I usually tell them that the business services, they don't need to be all at the same maturity stage. Would you agree with that? I could have like printing is very mature in the same enterprise or same organization, but not, web hosting doesn't have to be at the same maturity.
Yeah, perfectly acceptable. Again, similar to the earlier question, it's all about what you're comfortable doing. Don't feel you have to have every single answer out of the gate. Once you get started, I've found once you get a few of them built, the folks that aren't as mature or aren't as confident in their data, they look at that as the example and say, oh, I could do this, this, and this. And oh, what about this? And now your view of the CMDB starts to explode because people are understanding it and then they're getting excited about it. So you got to start somewhere. Don't feel that you have to do all of it at once. So totally agree.
All right. Well, I appreciate you all. Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Scott. Kevin, did you have one more question, or are you guys good?
I'm good because this is perfect. This came up today because we're starting this exercise this afternoon.
Go for it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I just released a poll into the chat window. Definitely feel free to fill that out before you guys head out. This is a means to get us some good feedback so we can help and improve these office hours. Thank you as always, Scott. I can just tell you by all the different types of feedback we always receive, it's just a pleasure having you on these, and the amount of information you relay is just really great. So thank you for that. Thank you, customers, for joining. As soon as you guys fill out that poll, have a great rest of your Friday and weekend. And for those who are listening to the recording, definitely continue to watch and look forward to new office hours. So one more big item, we do have the office hours hosted now on our community page. So I'm going to show my screen. Give me one quick minute, and a link I'll put inside the chat window. Let's see here. Okay, I want to share my screen. If it will let me. Oh, here we go. All right, can you guys see my screen okay? Here we have it on our ITBM community site. The link is here. I'm going to post this into the chat window. It's communityservicenow.com/community. And you're going to look up for the ITBM and Impound office hours. But that's where we're going to have all the recordings for these moving forward. So I won't be sending out the recording like I typically do on the email invite. Rather, we'll just be posting them. And as you can see, we have all of the office hours that are upcoming. So you can register for those here by clicking on the link, as well as access to all the older recordings of any previous office hours that we have. So scenario planning was the one that we had in January 29th. The office hour recording is there. And as soon as it's available here from Zoom, we'll have the one from Scott Lim as well posted up there. So thank you all so much. We'll put that into the chat window. Let me know if you guys have any other questions, but have a great Friday and the rest of your weekend.
Great. Thank you. Great session.
Thank you.